February 18th, 1944. Chebakul Training Ground, Ural Military District. The wind cut across the frozen parade ground like a knife, carrying with it the smell of coal smoke, diesel, and iron. Snow squeaked under boots and tank tracks as rows of dark green T-34s sat in formation, their guns pointing toward a pale, washed-out sky. Engines idled in a low, growling chorus. In front of the line of machines, a group of new recruits stood shivering in oversized quilted jackets. Among them were 6 women. The men had already given them a nickname: the Dolls Platoon. Maria Mikhailova tugged her fur hat lower over her ears and tried to ignore the stares. At 23, she had already outlived a husband and a brother, both killed near Stalingrad. The telegrams still sat folded in her breast pocket, worn soft from her fingers, worrying the creases at night. She'd come here not to hide from grief, but to give it teeth. Now she stood in front of a T-34 with a chalked number on its turret, 432. A driver mechanic, a woman, in a machine designed to smash its way through the Wehrmacht. Beside her, Lyuba Tarasenko, the new loader, muttered out of the corner of her mouth, "If they stare harder, they'll fall over." Maria didn't look away from the tank. "Let them," she said. "They can dig the ruts our tracks will use later." Down the row, a group of men from another company watched, half amused, half offended. "Look at this," one of them said, a broad-shouldered sergeant with oil-stained hands and a scar along his jaw. "They've turned the tank park into a sewing circle." The others laughed. "Maybe the Germans will die of shame when they see who's driving our tanks," another added. The laughter carried clearly over the cold air. Maria heard every word. She also saw the old captain standing on the platform near the fuel drums glance sharply at the men. Captain Leonid Rogachev, commander of the training battalion, had spent 3 years watching boys die in metal coffins from Stalingrad to Kharkov. He had no patience for jokes. He stepped forward and raised his voice. "Enough." The laughter died. Rogachev let the silence stretch. His greatcoat snapped in the wind, medals dull in the grey light. "You think the Germans asked whether the people burning in their tanks were men or women?" he asked. "You think the artillery shells over Kursk checked passports before they landed?" He pointed at the T-34s. "These don't care who sits in them. They care who can drive, who can shoot, who can keep the engine running when the oil is freezing and the air is full of dust and metal." He turned to the line of women. "You want to prove you belong here," Rogachev said. "Then today you start by making these machines yours." He looked back at the men. "And you—" His eyes swept the crowd. "If any of you believes you are too good to fight beside a woman, you can tell the regiment political officer you'd prefer to explain that to the families of the dead at Stalingrad." No one moved. Rogachev nodded once, sharply. "Driver mechanics, mount up. Today you learn what your tank smells like, sounds like, feels like. If I blindfold you, I want you to know where every lever is." He blew his whistle. Engines roared louder. The ground vibrated. Maria swallowed, then grabbed the cold metal handhold and hauled herself onto the T-34's glacis. For a moment, she stood on the steel nose, boots squeaking against frost, looking down at that broad slab of armor. Men had told her, in letters, in whispers before leaving for the front, that the T-34 was half beast, half brother. If it liked you, it would carry you through anything. If it didn't, it would kill you in seconds without meaning to. She placed her palm gently against the hull. "All right," she murmured. "Let's see if you like me." Then she swung herself down into the driver's hatch. The inside of the T-34 smelled of old oil, hot metal, and a faint sweetness of antifreeze. The driver's seat was little more than a padded metal pan, control levers rose on either side like iron bones. The gearbox, a brutal 4-speed block, sat beneath her boots. Half the space seemed taken up by the transmission tunnel, the other half by the enormous fuel tanks and ammunition racks stretching behind. Sergeant Artyom Sidorov, a veteran instructor with eyes that looked permanently tired, leaned into the open hatch. "Well, Mikhailova," he said, "this isn't a sewing machine, eh?" He watched her closely for a flinch. She met his gaze calmly. "If it was, Comrade Sergeant, I'd ask for a different model. I prefer something that bites." Someone snorted behind him. Sidorov's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "We'll see if it bites you back," he said. "Hands on the levers, feet on the pedals. Feel them. They'll be your hands and feet soon enough." Maria ran her gloved fingers along each control. Clutch pedal, brake, accelerator, gear lever. The hand levers for steering, linked to the clutches on each track. Each had a different weight, a different resistance. She pushed and pulled gently, learning where they stopped, where the movement tightened. Sidorov tapped the bulkhead above her. "Listen to the engine," he said. "When she talks, you answer with the gears. If you jam them, she'll scream and die, so don't jam them." He signaled to the mechanic standing beside the engine compartment. "Start her up." The V2 diesel coughed, sputtered once, then caught and rose into a guttural, thrumming roar. The whole hull shook. Vibrations traveled up through the seat and into her spine. Maria closed her eyes for a second. The tank wasn't a shape of steel anymore. It was something alive. Sidorov watched her face soften. "Good," he said quietly. "Remember that feeling. If you treat her like a tractor, she'll treat you like frozen meat. Treat her like a partner, and she might just keep you alive." By mid-morning, the training ground had become a blur of moving metal. T-34s circled along a rough track carved into the snow, engines howling as drivers ground gears and fought the steering levers. Instructors shouted through open hatches, their words torn away by the wind and the deafening noise. Tank 432 jolted forward as Maria eased the clutch and coaxed the gear stick into first. The hull shuddered, tracks biting into the snow and dirt, throwing up clods of frozen earth. The first few meters were not graceful. The tank lurched side to side as she overcorrected with the steering levers. "Ease it!" Sidorov barked from the commander's position, his head poking out of the turret. "You're not wrestling a bear. You're talking to her. Smooth!" She gritted her teeth, relaxed her grip a fraction, and loosened her shoulders. The vibrations became a rhythm instead of an assault. The tank straightened. Ahead, the track dipped into a shallow, ice-crusted trench. She remembered Sidorov's lecture about the T-34's Christie suspension, about how it could take obstacles at speed if you trusted it. She pressed the accelerator. The tank hit the trench, bounced, and climbed out again with a heavy, rolling sway. Lyuba yelped from inside the turret. "Warn a girl next time." Sidorov laughed sharply. "The Germans won't warn you either." They completed the first lap slower than the others, but without stalling. On the second, they picked up speed. On the third, she felt something click into place, a sense that the machine was no longer an unpredictable beast, but something whose moods she could begin to read. When they finally pulled off the course, steam rising from the radiator grill, Sidorov slid down from the turret and looked at her through the hatch. "Well, Mikhailova," he said, "you didn't kill us. I might even allow you to park near me without saying goodbye to my family first." He raised his voice so the nearby men could hear. "She takes corners better than half of you useless goats," a few of the male drivers grumbled. One, the broad-shouldered sergeant from earlier, walked past with a forced smirk. "Don't get used to the compliments," he muttered. "First mud, first shell. We'll see who's still laughing." Maria watched him go, then looked back at the tank's instrument panel. flickering gauges, trembling needles. "First mud, first shell," she said quietly to herself. "We'll see." That night, in the drafty barracks that smelled of wet wool and tobacco, Maria sat on her bunk beneath a naked light bulb, the engine vibration still buzzing faintly in her bones. The other women were already half asleep, boots lined in a row beneath their bunks, uniforms steaming faintly as they dried. She unfolded the 2 telegrams she carried, one for Nikolai, one for Andrei. The creases were white lines now, on the edge of tearing. Missing in action near Stalingrad. Presumed killed. Killed in action. Buried in mass grave. Location undisclosed. She ran her thumb along the typewritten lines, then folded them again and tucked them back into their place over her heart. "Tomorrow," Lyuba mumbled from the bunk above. "They said we're learning live gunnery." Maria glanced up. "With us driving." "With you driving," Lyuba said. "They want the dolls to see what happens when the gun goes off." Maria lay back, staring at the underside of the bunk above her, listening to the distant rumble of tanks being moved into the sheds for the night. Somewhere beyond the Urals, men in grey uniforms were resting too. Somewhere, German tank crews were also sleeping beside their machines, confident that Soviet armor was brute force, not finesse, that Soviet women belonged in factories, not in tank hulls. She closed her eyes. "Laugh now," she whispered into the dark. "Laugh while you can." Outside in the snow-covered motor pool, Tank 432 sat cooling in the night air, metal ticking faintly as it shed the day's heat. Its tracks were still crusted with ice and frozen mud, its gun dark and silent. Within months, that same machine would be buried up to its hull in spring thaw mud, facing the full weight of a German assault. Within months, people who had laughed at the idea of women in tanks would be gripping the radio handset and screaming for anyone, male or female, to hold the line. They would learn, and the price of that lesson would be paid in diesel, steel, and blood. The next morning, the cold felt sharper. Tank 432 idled in a shallow depression at the edge of the range, its engine thumping, exhaust streaming in a pale plume. Ahead, a row of rusted steel silhouettes, old tank hulls, concrete bunkers, a mock anti-tank gun, stood half buried in snow and churned earth. Beyond them, the low Ural hills rose into a white horizon. Maria sat in the driver's seat, boots braced, hands on the levers. Above and behind her, the rest of the crew settled into place. Lyuba Tarasenko, loader, wedged herself beside the 76mm gun breech, stacked brass shells within arm's reach. Zhenya Volnova, sharp-eyed and quiet, took the gunner's sight, one hand resting on the elevation wheel. Nina Podolskaya, radio operator, adjusted the throat microphone, fingers tracing the worn bakelite of the transmitter. And in the commander's position, standing half out of the turret with binoculars around his neck, was Junior Lieutenant Viktor Zorin, tall, thin, with dark hair and the wary look of a man who'd already seen too much. He had been sent from the front to gain experience as an instructor. Everyone understood what that meant. He'd lost most of a company at Kursk. Command had decided he should live long enough to train others. He rapped his knuckles lightly on the turret ring. "All right. Doll's crew," he said into the intercom, his tone dry. "Let's see if you can make some noise." Maria keyed the throat mic. "Driver ready?" "Loader ready," Lyuba replied, already grinning. "Gunner ready," Zhenya added, voice calm. "Radio ready," Nina whispered. Zorin glanced at the red flag fluttering near the range officer's stand. A second later, it dropped. "Forward first gear," he ordered. "Take us to the firing line, Mikhailova." She eased the clutch, fed in throttle. The tank lumbered forward, tracks clanking over frozen ruts. They rolled up onto the firing point, white stones marking the hull-down position. "Brake," Zorin said. "Hold." The tank settled with a groan as Mariah stomped the pedals and pulled the levers. Ahead, through the narrow driver's visor, she could make out the hulking silhouette of an old Panzer III carcass used as a target 600 meters away. Inside the turret, Zorin ducked down. "Target! Enemy tank, 600. Zhenya, you see him?" Zhenya swung the turret gently, hands confident on the traverse wheel. Through the telescopic sight, the world narrowed to crosshairs and metal. "Got him. AP shell," Zorin said. "Lyuba?" The loader had already grabbed one, its weight familiar now, and slammed it into the open breach. The shell seated with a heavy clank. "Loaded!" Maria could feel the tension rise inside the hull, an invisible pressure. Zorin's voice came low. "Gunner, fire!" The T-34's 76mm gun did not simply fire. It punched reality. The blast hit like a hammer, deafening even through the padded headset. The entire hull lurched back on its springs. Dust and paint flakes rained down. The noise was a physical thing. Through her slit, Maria saw the muzzle flash bloom. Then a heartbeat later, a puff of impact on the distant hulk, just right of center mass. "Hit," Zorin said, surprised despite himself. "Slight right." Instructors on the range, standing behind a berm with binoculars, scribbled notes. Inside the tank, Lyuba whooped, "Again! Again!" Zorin allowed himself a brief smile. "Very well, again. Mikhailova, back 10 meters, then forward into position. I want you dancing with the gunfire, not sitting like a log." "Yes, Comrade Lieutenant." She reversed, shifted, rolled forward again, feeling how the engine note changed with throttle, how the tracks bit differently in churned snow. The second shot came faster. So did the third. On the fourth, Zorin stopped calling corrections. He didn't need to. By midday, word had reached the others on the training ground. The so-called Doll's platoon wasn't just keeping up. On the gunnery board, Tank 432 was climbing. Near the fuel dump, the broad-shouldered sergeant with the jaw scar, Sergeant Kolya Morozov, watched the impact bursts through a set of battered field glasses. His own crew had taken 3 shots to walk their rounds onto the mock bunker. He lowered the glasses, frowned, and spat into the snow. "Fluke," he muttered. Beside him, one of his crew shrugged. "Fluke happens 4 times in a row?" Morozov didn't answer. In the afternoon they combined driving and firing. T-34s roared around a circuit, popping out from behind earthen berms to fire on the move. It was brutal on the crew. Every jolt threw bodies against armor and ammunition racks. The smell of cordite mixed with exhaust and sweat until it became a single choking atmosphere. "Left berm 300, Zorin barked. "German gun pit, mesh and logs." "Target seen," Zhenya replied. Maria felt the tank shudder as it climbed the berm, the nose tipping up. She couldn't see the target from her slit now, only the white sky and black tree line. "Hold speed," came Zorin's voice. "Do not stop. Lyuba, he shell." "Loaded!" Lyuba slammed the breech closed. "Fire!" The gun crashed again. This time the recoil jolted them sideways as the hull lurched over uneven ground. Nina threw out a hand to steady herself, the radio headset nearly sliding off. "Hit," Zorin said after a moment. "Good enough to bury them." They circled back, over and over, until each of them could feel the rhythm without being told. Accelerate, turn, level, fire, recover. By the time the red flag signaled the end of exercises, Tank 432 had earned a small chalked star on the scoreboard, posted near the range office. Top third in the battalion, the only crew with more than one woman, the only crew nobody was laughing at anymore. That evening, as the sun sank low and turned the snow the color of old ash, The battalion gathered in the yard between the barracks and the motor pool. A small wooden platform had been dragged out. On it stood the regiment's political officer, Senior Lieutenant Fedorov, in a worn leather coat, red star gleaming on his cap. He let his gaze pass over the men and women, over the soot-streaked faces, the frostbitten noses, the oil-grimed hands. "You all know why you're here," he began. "You have seen the casualty lists. You have heard what happened at Stalingrad, at Voronezh, at Kursk. The motherland has bled enough steel and blood to drown half of Europe." He paused, eyes resting briefly on Maria's group. "Some of you," his gaze shifted to the women, "are here because there are no more brothers left to send. Some because your husbands went and did not return. Some because you saw our cities burn and decided you would rather burn in a tank than in your own bed." A murmur went through the crowd. Fedorov jabbed a finger toward the dark shapes of the T-34s behind them. "These are your arguments now. These are your votes in history. When you go west from here, no one will care if you are from Moscow or Saratov, if you are 19 or 40, if you are male or female. The German shell that hits your hull does not check." He leaned forward, voice hardening. "You have one task, to break the fascist line, or to die making sure it doesn't break you." There was a grim nodding. No one clapped. It was not that kind of speech. Afterward, as the crews dispersed, Sergeant Morozov approached Tank 432. Maria and Lyuba were checking track pins by lantern light, their breath steaming. Morozov watched silently for a moment, then grunted. "You kept her straight today," he said to Maria, jerking his chin at the tank. "I've seen worse driving from men who brag twice as much." Maria straightened, surprised. "Thank you, Comrade Sergeant." He scratched his scar idly, eyes on the hull. "Front doesn't care who's at the controls," he said. "Just cares whether the tank gets there. Remember that. And," he hesitated, "don't trust the gearbox. T-34 will chew it if you slam it." She nodded. "I'll listen to her." He snorted. "Good. Maybe she'll listen back." As he walked away, Lyuba leaned close and whispered, "He didn't call us dolls." "Progress," Maria said. Winter began to loosen its grip. Snow turned to slush, then to rutted mud. The tanks traded white frost for brown streaks of thawing earth. Training grew harsher. Night maneuvers, live fire exercises in blowing snow, recovery drills where crews had to tow bogged-down tanks out of ice-clogged gullies. One morning, the motor pool loudspeaker crackled to life as crews were checking oil levels. "Attention, attention! Tank battalion, assemble on the yard with commanders and drivers. Orders from Army headquarters." Maria felt her stomach tighten. She wiped her hands on a rag and followed the others. Rogachev waited with a sheaf of papers. Behind him, a map of the Western Front had been tacked to a wooden board. Belarus, Ukraine, Poland, a web of front lines and arrows. He cleared his throat. "Comrades, the time for practice is ending." He tapped the map. "Our forces are preparing a new offensive. The Germans have dug in along the rivers and villages west of Kiev. First Ukrainian front needs experienced crews and fresh machines." He looked at the ranks, faces now harder than when they had arrived. "Our regiment is being attached to the 1st Guards Tank Brigade. You will be replacements. That means you will be arriving where others have already died." He began reading names and hull numbers. Tank 417, Tank 426, Tank 432, crew under Lieutenant Zorin. Maria felt something twist in her chest. Assigned to 1st Battalion, 1st Guards Tank Brigade. Departure in 48 hours. Load your vehicles onto rail transport and prepare supplies for 10 days of combat. Lyuba whispered, "That's it. No more test targets." Nina swallowed, eyes wide. Zhenya simply nodded once, as if she'd already seen this in her mind. Later, as they drove 432 up the crude ramps onto the flatbed railcar, villagers from the nearby settlement gathered by. The tracks. Women with scarves over their hair, children in patched coats, an old man leaning on a stick, his eyes milky but still sharp enough to see the tanks. One babushka stepped forward as 432 halted. She looked up, squinting, and saw Maria's face in the driver's hatch. Her eyes widened. "A girl?" she murmured. Maria smiled faintly and gave a small nod. The old woman reached up as if to touch the steel, then instead made the sign of the cross over the hull. "Drive well, granddaughter," she said. "Bring that gun back, pointing west, not east." "I'll try," Maria said softly. The train clattered across the endless snowfields, then through forests of black pines and birch, then past the charred skeletons of villages that had felt war's touch already. Inside the tank, the crew slept in shifts, using engine covers and canvas for blankets. At night, the rail cars creaked and swayed, metal groaning like a restless animal. Sometimes they rode in an open wagon, watching the landscape slide by. Wrecked vehicles rusted, half buried in snow. Burned-out houses. A church dome collapsed, its cross hanging sideways. Once, they passed a siding where another train sat motionless, its flatbeds empty except for twisted hulls. Tanks that had gone west before them and were now coming back as scrap. Liuba watched in silence, then forced a laugh that sounded brittle. "Look on the bright side," she said. "We know there's work for mechanics." No one laughed. At night, Maria lay awake, feeling the vibration of the wheels through the hull floor. She thought of Nikolai's last letter from the front, about how he'd written that the earth itself trembles when the tanks advance. Now she was inside that trembling. Somewhere ahead lay their brigade. Somewhere ahead, German guns waited. Somewhere ahead was the line someone would tell them to hold. She wondered what it would feel like when the first real shell struck near the hull, whether she would freeze or move faster than she thought possible, whether the tank would like her enough to keep going. They knew they were close before anyone said a word. The air changed first. It lost the clean edge of snow and pine and gained something heavier: smoke, burned fuel, a faint sweet-sour stench of things that had been alive and weren't anymore. When the train slowed near a junction, they saw it, not on a map, but in the ground. Cratered fields, trees shredded into splinters, a line of horse-drawn wagons carrying the wounded eastward, blankets stained through. A group of infantrymen in tattered greatcoats, mud up to their knees, staring up at the tanks with a mixture of weary hope and something like pity. A captain from the 1st Guards Tank Brigade met them at the unloading point. His face was lined, his uniform faded, but his eyes were sharp. "You're the new replacements?" he asked Zorin, glancing past him at the crew of 432. His gaze paused for half a second when he saw the women, then moved on without comment. "Good. You won't stay new for long." He jabbed a finger toward the west. "The Germans are dug in along a ridge above a village called Novaya Lubanka. They've got Panthers, PaK-40s, and more machine guns than sense. Our last attempt to push them off cost us 8 tanks and a company of infantry." He looked each of them in the eye. "Tomorrow, you'll see what that looks like. Today, get your machines fueled, armed, and into the tree line. Your reserve company. When, not if, the line cracks, we plug the gap with you." Maria felt her throat go dry. Plug the gap. She glanced at 432, now sitting on solid ground again, as fuel trucks rolled up and ammunition crates were opened. The training grounds of Chebakul felt like another planet. Here, the line wasn't ink on a map. It was churned earth and broken bodies. and soon someone would point to a sector and say, "Hold that." Dawn came as a grey smear filtered through low clouds, hanging over a landscape hammered flat by artillery. The village of Novaya Lubanka lay ahead in ruins, a cluster of shattered houses, roofless barns, and a church steeple broken in half like a snapped matchstick. Beyond the village, a low ridge rose, its slopes scarred by tank tracks and craters. That was where the Germans sat. Tank 432 crouched under a stand of bare birch trees, its dark shape half concealed by branches and camouflage netting. Frost clung to the hull where the night's cold had gnawed at the metal. Inside, the crew sat at their positions, helmets on, harnesses tight, each alone with their thoughts and the smell of fuel and cold steel. Maria flexed her fingers on the steering levers. The engine idled behind her, a steady growl sending vibrations through the hull. She could feel it even with her eyes closed. Slight fluctuations in RPM, faint rattles that told her the transmission still didn't like second gear if you rushed it. "Driver!" came Zoran's voice through the intercom, calm but edged. "You awake down there?" "If this is a dream, Comrade Lieutenant, it's a loud one," she replied. Lyuba snorted softly from the turret. "At least in this dream, I can throw 76mm arguments at people." Nina said nothing, fingers resting on the radio controls, lips moving in a silent prayer she'd never admit to saying. Zhenya didn't speak either. She simply stared through the gunner's sight, tracking nothing yet, but ready. Outside, engines were warming across the tree line. The first guard's tanks sat in a broken line facing the village outskirts. Some bore scars already, patched armor plates, scorched paint, track links welded over old penetrations. These machines had been here long enough to learn the ridge's contours by feel. A runner approached the trees, breath puffing in the cold. "Lieutenant Zorin! Orders from battalion!" The hatch clanged as Zorin popped it open and listened. When he dropped back inside, his jaw was set a little more tightly. "Here it is," he said into the intercom. "First Battalion is going to try and push them off the ridge again. We stay in reserve, back here in the tree line. If they punch through our infantry on the left, we plug the gap between the village and that copse of trees on the low ground. That's our sector." Lyuba blew out a slow breath. "So we're the cork in the bottle." "Exactly," he said. "If the cork pops, the Germans pour through." He didn't add what everyone knew. If the Germans broke through here, they could roll up the flank of the entire division. Soviet guns lined up behind the tank park, 122mm howitzers, 76mm field guns, Katyusha trucks hidden under camouflage nets, opened fire in a rolling crash that shook the air. Shells screamed overhead and burst on the ridgeline, throwing up geysers of earth and smoke. Somewhere in that maelstrom, German positions, machine gun nests, dug-in Panthers, anti-tank guns, ducked and waited. The tanks of 1st Battalion rolled out from cover, one company after another, their tracks chewing the frozen ground into sludge as they advanced toward the village. Infantry followed in their wake, hunched shapes in greatcoats, rifles slung, some clinging to the backs of the tanks. From her slit, Maria could see glimpses of the advance between birch trunks, the flicker of muzzle flashes, the sudden flares of explosions. Even through the hull, she felt the near impacts as dull thumps. Then, after several long minutes of their own artillery firing, the sound changed. German guns answered, sharp, flat cracks of anti-tank guns, deeper booms of tank main guns. The crump of incoming shells struck positions just ahead of the Soviet line. "Listen," Zorin said quietly, "that rhythmic firing, they're using Pak-40s and Panthers, probably in hull-down spots on the reverse of the ridge." Nina leaned against the radio. "First Battalion reports heavy fire," she said, voice tight as she listened to the clipped transmissions. "Tanks hit, infantry pinned. They're calling for more smoke on the left." One of the tank engines out front revved high, then cut off abruptly. Maria didn't need to see it to know what that meant. 20 minutes later, the tree line was full of wounded. Stretcher bearers staggered past the tanks, faces pale under grime, carrying men whose uniforms were charred, torn, soaked in blood. A T-34 limped back, with one road wheel missing, its track flapping loose, smoke leaking from its rear deck. Zorin popped the hatch and scanned the field. Through the drifting smoke, he could see shapes burning on the approaches to the village, silhouettes of tanks with their turrets knocked askew, flames licking from open hatches. "First Battalion is stalled," Nina reported. "They say the left flank took the worst of it. Anti-tank fire from the orchard near the village and from the ridge. Our infantry's pulled back to the ditch line." Maria could hear the frustration in the commander's exhale. "Of course they have an orchard," Lyuba muttered. "The Germans always have a cozy orchard full of guns." A few minutes later, the radio crackled with a new message, voice clipped, urgent. "Reserve company, prepare to advance. Enemy armor and infantry are probing the gap on the left. Repeat, prepare to advance. Seal that line, comrades, or we lose the position." Zorin's reply was simple. "Understood. Reserve company moving." He dropped back in and closed the hatch. "That's us," he said. "Make peace with whoever you need to, because in 5 minutes we go forward." The crew fell into a tense quiet. Maria stared at her hands on the levers. They weren't shaking. Good. She swallowed. "Where do you want us?" she asked. Zorin unfolded a map clipped to the inside of the turret, tapping a line between two penciled marks. "See that shallow draw between the village and the copse?" he said. "Our line's thin there. Germans are trying to force armor through the hollow, under cover of the ridge and what's left of the village walls." He looked toward the tree line they hid in. "We go there. We hold that low ground, no matter what. Driver, forward, second gear. Stay under the smoke as long as you can." The other reserve tanks were already moving, engines roaring as they nosed out of the trees and onto the scarred fields. 432 followed, the hull jolting over roots and shell holes. As they cleared the tree line, the landscape opened up, a churned expanse of brown and grey, with the skeletal remains of fences and houses scattered like broken bones. Ahead and to the left, the village of Novaya Lubanka smouldered. Roof beams jutted at odd angles. A church wall stood alone, its icon shattered, its cross gone. Dark shapes moved among the ruins, German infantry darting between cover, machine guns at the ready. To the right, the ridge loomed. At its crest, barely visible through smoke, Maria could see the squared silhouettes of panthers dug in, their long guns pointing downslope. "Keep us weaving," Zorin said. "Don't give those guns a straight line." She did, guiding the tank in a zigzag, feeling how the ground pulled at the tracks, how the hull wanted to slide in the half-thawed muck. The first shell landed close enough to rock them sideways. "Left side, high explosive," Lyuba shouted over the intercom. "Keep going," Zorin snapped. "We stop, we die." They crested a slight rise, and then dipped into the shallow draw Zorin had indicated, a strip of slightly lower ground between two smouldering copses of trees. It was muddy, churned by previous assaults, but it provided something precious, partial cover. "Here," he said. "This is the hinge. If the Germans break through here, they roll up our trench line and hit artillery from behind. We hold this, or everyone behind us pays." Maria brought the tank to a halt at the bottom of the draw, nose angled slightly toward the village. "Driver, hull down," Zorin ordered. She reversed carefully, until the earthwork in front of them hid most of the hull, leaving only the turret and upper glacis visible. Good. Gunner, start hunting. Zhenya swiveled the turret toward the village. Through her sight, the smoking ruins sharpened into a jagged city of broken geometry. She scanned, slowly, methodically. Movement. Half a German half-track nosing out from behind a shed. Infantry shapes crouched behind a low stone wall, muzzle flashes winking. Infantry and vehicles in the village, she reported. Range 300. Half-track near collapsed barn. AP first, Zorin said. Lyuba, loaded, Lyuba shouted, ramming an armor-piercing shell into the breach. Driver, slight forward, Zorin ordered. Give the gun a better angle. Maria eased the tank up just enough. The sight steadied. Fire. The gun thundered. Through her narrow view, Maria saw the half-track's front erupt in sparks and fragments. The vehicle lurched sideways, then caught fire. Hit, Zhenya said simply. Cracks of rifle and machine gun fire answered, bullets spanging off the T-34's turret and hull with sharp metallic whines. Gunner, he, Zorin said. Those infantry behind the wall. Range 280. Loaded, Lyuba again. Fire. The wall disintegrated under the high explosive blast, figures thrown backward like ragdolls. Zorin exhaled once, sharply. Good, but they're not the real problem. As if to punctuate his words, a German armor-piercing shell smashed into the earth just above the draw, throwing mud and shrapnel across the hull. Panthers on the ridge, Nina said, voice tight. They've seen us. Zorin raised his periscope, scanning uphill. Gunner, turret right 10 degrees, he ordered. Look high, just below the crest. They'll be in dugouts. Zhenya adjusted, breath slow, steady. Through the smoke and haze, a dark rectangle came into focus. The top of a Panther's turret, in a hull-down position. Only the gun and a sliver of armor visible. Got one, she said. Range 750. AP, take his eyes, Zorin said. Driver, when she fires, reverse 2 meters. Don't wait for me. Understood, Maria replied. Fire. The 76mm spat flame. Maria slammed the tank into reverse, even before the recoil finished, the hull sliding back down a little. A heartbeat later, a shell from the Panther hit where they'd been, smashing the lip of the draw into a shower of dirt. Hit the mantlet, Zhenya said, eyes still in the sight. He's still there, but he's blinded for a moment. He pulled back. Good. Make him blink, Zorin said. We don't need to kill them all. We just need to keep them from seeing. The radio crackled. Voices from other tanks in reserve company. Tank 421. Hit tracks, but still mobile. Engaging infantry in orchard. Tank 438. Enemy armor probing on our right. 2 Mark IVs moving down the hollow. Hold position, Zorin transmitted calmly. Our sector is the center of the gap. Let the others handle the flanks, unless they break. We are the wall. Understand? The wall. He switched back to internal. You hear that, crew? Today we're bricks. Lyuba snorted. Better than being dust. For the next 30 minutes, the fight became a rhythm of controlled chaos. German infantry probed down the hollow, trying to exploit the low ground. 432, and the tanks alongside it answered with shells and machine gun bursts. Each time the Germans got close, high explosive and shrapnel tore into their formations, forcing them back. Twice, Panthers on the ridge tried to pick them off, but each time Zhenya was waiting, sending rounds that smashed their sights or forced them to pull back behind the crest. The ground in front of the draw became a ragged killing field, craters, wrecks, bodies half hidden by smoke. Then, through the drifting haze on their right, Maria saw something that made her stomach clench. A T-34, one of the other reserve tanks, led by an older male crew, pulled back from its position, smoke trailing from its rear plate. It wasn't crippled, The tracks still bit. The turret still turned. But it was retreating, turning its nose away from the hollow. On the radio, a shaken voice cut through. "This is 436. We're hit in the fuel tank, minor fire. Pulling back, can't hold, repeat, can't." Another voice, harsher, overrode it. "Battalion's comms officer. 436, you will hold that position until ordered otherwise. Fires can be fought. If that line opens, you bring death on every infantryman behind you." But the tank kept moving. It slid back behind a copse of trees, leaving a gap. Zorin saw it, jaw tightening. "Damn it," he hissed. "They've left a hole." He looked at the map board, then through the periscope toward the now thin line. "Driver," he said, "forward 5 meters, angle us right. We're covering their sector now, too." "Understood," Maria said. She pushed the tank forward, feeling the hull climb just enough to gain a little more view of the killing ground. It also meant more of their own armor was exposed. Lyuba didn't complain. She just hefted another shell into the breach. "More bricks, fewer gaps," she muttered. The German response was immediate. Infantry surged again, now angling toward the spot where 436 had been. A stubby-nosed Panzer IV appeared briefly between ruined houses, firing at the tree line. "Gunner! Panzer! Village Street! Range 400! Zorin snapped. "I see him!" Zhenya said. "AP loaded! Fire!" The gun cracked. The Panzer IV rocked as the shell slammed into its side. Armor. Smoke began to pour from its hatches. German mortar rounds began falling closer now, splashing dirt and fragments around the draw. One struck near enough to clang shards off the hull. Nina flinched, then forced herself back toward the radio. Her hands shook, but her voice did not when she transmitted. 432 to battalion, center of gap holding, enemy infantry repulsed, 1 Panzer burning. Right neighbor withdrew. We're covering extra sector. There was a pause. Then the battalion commander's voice came back, edged with strain. 432, acknowledged. You must hold that ground. Reinforcements are delayed. You are the line now. Understood. Zorin glanced around at his crew, though they couldn't see him. He could hear their breathing in his headset. Understood, he said. We're not going anywhere. He switched back to internal channel. You hear that? He said. There it is. This is what you trained for in Chebakul. This is the moment all the jokes and stares were about. Another shell exploded overhead. Earth showered the hull. We hold, Zorin said quietly, or there's nothing behind us left to hold. Maria settled deeper into her seat, hands tightening on the levers. Her fear had gone somewhere, not vanished, but melted into a sharp, cold clarity. The tank hummed around her, alive and angry. All right, she murmured to the machine. Let's show them what kind of girl you are. She eased 432 a little higher on the lip of the draw, giving Zhenya a better field of fire, even as bullets and shrapnel rang louder off the armor. Outside, in the smoke and mud, men who had laughed at the idea of women in tanks now watched through their periscopes and trenches as 432 stayed where others had pulled back, its gun barking again and again, its hull refusing to yield an inch of ground. The gap remained closed, at least for now. The fight blurred into a single, endless hour. Time stopped being minutes and became cycles of movement and impact. Spot target, load, fire, reverse, move forward, brace, repeat. The world outside was reduced to shapes in smoke and flashes in Zhenya's sight. For Maria, it was vibrations through the hull and the sharp metallic clang of hits that did not penetrate. German infantry tried again and again to slip down the hollow and through the gap. Each time, 432 and the few tanks still holding nearby answered with high explosive shells and machine gun bursts that chewed up earth and bodies alike. The ground in front of them turned into a churned, messy strip of mud, snow, and motionless shapes. The Panthers on the ridge fired when they could, but the T-34's constant shifting, forward, back, a meter left, a meter right, made 432 a slippery target. Twice, armor-piercing shells slammed close enough to shower them in dirt and rock. Once, a hit on the upper glasses sent a deafening clang through the hull and spiderweb cracks through Maria's periscope. Glass. "You all right down there?" Zorin shouted. "I'm here," she replied, blinking dust from her eyes. "She's still talking." "Good. Keep her talking." Her arms ached. Her legs felt like lead. But the tank moved when she told it to move, stopped when she wanted, backed down an inch at a time when Zorin yelled, "Reverse!" before a shot. Inside the turret, the noise was a constant assault. Gun crashes, shell casings hitting the floor, Lyuba's grunts as she hefted ammunition, Zhenya's controlled breathing, Nina's quiet, clipped words into the radio. At some point, Lyuba's shoulder began to give out. Maria could hear it in her voice, the strain hidden under jokes. "How many shells we got left?" Lyuba puffed. "Enough to make you regret asking," Zorin said. "Keep feeding her." "Yes, comrade slave driver." But she kept going. Around mid-morning, just as the crew started to wonder how much more the tank and their bodies could take, the radio crackled with a different tone. "Artillery to all forward elements. Stand by. Rolling barrage on German positions along the ridge in 3 minutes. Mark your positions with smoke if you're able. We'll bracket forward of you." A minute later, another voice. Infantry this time. "Reserve company, this is 3rd Rifle Battalion. We're forming up behind your sector. When the barrage lifts, we counterattack to retake the left approaches. Hold for 10 more minutes, and you'll have bayonets beside you." Nina repeated it aloud, as if the others might be afraid to believe it. "Did you hear? We're getting help." Lyuba laughed once, harshly. "About time someone else wants to dance in this ballroom." Zorin allowed himself a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "All right," he said. 10 more minutes. We can do 10 minutes." Outside, Soviet guns spoke again. The new barrage slammed into the ridgeline and the ruined village, closer and heavier than before. Through the periscope and driver's slit, the world turned into a wall of dust and smoke. The Panthers disappeared behind curtains of earth and shrapnel. German fire slackened. Under that cover, Soviet infantry surged forward once more, dark shapes running low, then dropping, then getting up again. Some didn't get up. Others did, moving from shell hole to shell hole, from shattered wall to tree stump. "Look at them," Zorin murmured, watching their own riflemen advance through the killing ground 432 had held clear. "They're crazy." Lyuba's voice came back, softer than usual. "They're ours." When the barrage lifted, the sound changed again. It was no longer just artillery and long-range tank fire. It was closer now. Automatic weapons, grenades, individual rifles. The infantry had reached the outer edges of the village and the lower slopes of the ridge. Somewhere in those ruins, men were fighting room to room, tree to tree. German counterfire intensified, then began to fray. "Reserve company," the battalion commander called over the radio. "Push forward 50 meters. Support the infantry. Do not overextend. Keep your hulls in defilade when possible." Zorin nodded, even though no one could see it. "Driver forward, slow, stay low. Let the ground work for you." Maria coaxed the tank up the draw and onto slightly higher ground, feeling every bump and rut. The hull rose just enough to give the gun better depression toward the village. It also opened them more fully to whatever survived on the ridge and among the broken houses. "Target, machine gun nest behind collapsed wall, 2 o'clock, range 200, Zorin called. "I've got it," Zhenya replied. "He!" Lyuba's answer was immediate. "Loaded. Fire!" Another blast. Another shower of stone and splinters downrange. In the distance, a German soldier, tiny in the sight at this range, broke and ran. A Soviet infantryman stepped out from cover and shot him in the back. The man flopped into the mud and lay still. The ridgeline, once a solid ribbon of muzzle flashes, now sparkled only intermittently. A Panther tried to edge forward out of its dug-in pit to get a clearer shot, but a concentration of artillery and a lucky hit from another T-34's flank fire forced it back, black smoke licking from its engine deck. "Panther's hurt," Nina reported, relaying a call from another company. "Not dead, but not happy." "Good," Zorin said. "Let him sulk." The minutes stretched. The Germans did not give up easily. They shifted fire, tried once more to push down the hollow with a mix of infantry and an assault gun. 432 answered, along with the battered tanks still active on their right and left. The assault gun died first, its superstructure punched in by a well-placed round. The infantry behind it faded back into smoke. Then, gradually, a new sound came over the radio net. Laughter. Not much, not loud, but there. A kind of exhausted, disbelieving laughing among the rifle companies as word spread that the immediate counterattack had been blunted, that they were pushing the Germans off some forward positions for the first time in days. "Center holding," one infantry commander reported. "We're in their first trench line. Those tanks in the hollow, whoever is in that T-34, tell them they did good." Nina relayed it, her voice catching for just a moment. "They're talking about us," she said. Lyuba thumped the shell rack with her fist. "About time someone noticed our pretty faces." Maria let herself lean back for a second, hands still on the levers, eyes closed. The noise had not ceased. The danger was not gone. But something fundamental had shifted. They had not been the gap. They had been the plug. By midday, the attack had devolved into scattered firefights. The main German thrust along the hollow had been broken. Some of their positions on the ridge were smoking ruins. Others remained, but they were now under pressure from fresh Soviet units shifting in. Reserve Company was ordered to hold its position, while other tank units leapfrogged forward to exploit what gains they could. For the first time in hours, 432 sat still. The hull ticked as it cooled slightly. The smell inside was a heady mix of sweat, propellant, and hot metal. Spent shell casings littered the floor, rolling with every slight movement. Zorin opened the hatch cautiously and let cold air wash in. He squinted at the gray sky. "Crew," he said into the intercom, "one at a time, you can get some air. Stay near the tank." Lyuba was first, scrambling up like someone escaping a furnace. She sat on the turret edge, legs dangling, gulping icy air into burning lungs. Maria climbed out next, blinking in the harsh light. The world looked wider, farther. She hadn't realized how small the driver's view slit had made her universe. She slid down the glacis and dropped to the ground. Her legs wobbled for a second, muscles complaining after hours of tension. Up close, the tank bore scars. Gouges in the armor where near misses had thrown shrapnel. Black streaks along the hull where incendiary fragments had burned briefly. One small dent on the right side of the turret where a ricochet had hit and skipped away. She placed her palm over that dent. "You did well," she told the machine quietly. A shadow fell across her. She turned and found Sergeant Morozov standing there, helmet pushed back, face streaked with grime. His own tank sat farther down the draw, its side hull patched hastily where a shell had chewed off a fender. He looked at 432 for a long moment, then at her crew perched on and in it. "When they told me at Chebarkul we'd be getting women in tanks," he said, "I laughed. I said it was nonsense. Political theatre. Good for photographs, not for holding a line. He spat into the mud, not out of disgust, but out of habit. I watched your hull when 436 pulled back, he went on. I thought you'd go too. Any sane crew would. You didn't. He met her eyes. If you hadn't been here, that hollow would have been full of Germans an hour ago. I'd probably be dead or running. Maria didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to shrug it off, make a joke. Another part felt a hot, unexpected prickle at the corners of her eyes, so she just nodded once. We're not here to be pretty, Comrade Sergeant, she said. We're here because someone has to hold. He nodded back. Today you did. He glanced at the turret, where Lyuba and Zhenya were listening. The men will talk about it tonight. They won't call you dolls again. Lyuba grinned down. Good. We prefer terrifying steel Valkyries. He snorted. Don't push your luck. That night, in a shallow bivouac near the tree line, the crews shared what little food they had, huddled around stoves made from shell casings. Stories passed back and forth of shells that missed by inches, of tanks that brewed up in seconds, of infantrymen who'd charged when they could have run. More than once, someone glanced toward 432 and its crew. The story spread. How 432 had filled the spot when another tank pulled back. How its gun had barked without pause when the hollow nearly overflowed with Germans. How its driver had edged the hull higher under fire to give the gunner a better view. No one told it as a tale of women showing up men. They told it as a story of a crew that didn't break. But for those who'd laughed, the memory had a sharper edge. Months later, when the brigade pushed farther west and the front line shifted again, the details of that day blended into 100 other engagements. Novaya Lubanka became just another name on a long list of battered villages. Some of the men who had laughed at Chebakul never made it past that spring. A mine here, a shell there, a direct hit nobody could have survived. Others lived, and years after the war, sitting in cramped kitchens or on benches outside factory doors, they told stories of the tanks they had served in and the crews they had known. Sometimes, after a glass or two, one of them would say, "Did I ever tell you about the women who held a line the men couldn't?" And they'd talk about a T-34 with the number 432 on its turret, and a driver who didn't flinch, and a loader who refused to quit, and a gunner whose shots found whatever they needed to find. History would remember names like Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya and Lyudmila Pavlichenko, sniper and partisan. Fewer would remember the armored women whose stories never made it into official posters, but the ridge above Novaya Lubanka, for that one day, knew exactly who had held it. Steel, diesel, and a crew that refused to back away just because someone once laughed at the idea of women in tanks. In the end, the lesson was simple. The German shells that fell on the hollow did not ask who sat at the controls. The orders to hold did not come with footnotes. The line did not know or care who its defenders were. It only knew one thing. They held, and that was enough.